Some people call it death with dignities, others call it sin. After emotional debate, Washington, D.C.'s City Council approved a measure that will allow physician-assisted suicide. The law makes it legal for doctors to give deadly medication to a person who has less than 6 months to live. It doesn't even require a doctor to be present during the suicide. Joining me now for more is Melody Wood of the DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society at the Heritage Foundation. Melody, talk about the parameters of the law and what it does.
Hi, thanks for having me today. So as you were saying, the DC City Council voted yesterday to legalize physician-assisted suicide in the district. Now, this is a bad decision. It's a bad vote on a bad bill that would actually jeopardize the lives of many in the city. We hear death with dignity is a good thing, and we hear that suffering is bad. And I think we can all agree that suffering is bad, yet this law does not address it in a proper manner. Instead, this law would actually endanger the weak, marginalized, and poor in our society and make them the likely targets of being forced to commit suicide.
Well, we understand that some of the parameters include the person cannot be depressed and that the patient, him or herself, has to request the suicide pills on more than one occasion. But we understand there are some potential abuses to that system. Talk about that.
Yeah, they tried to draft the bill so that there wouldn't be abuses of the system. But when you look at it closely, there's several problems with the way that it was drafted. First of all, a family member or friend who could benefit financially from the death of a person is legally allowed to be a witness when the person is requesting the suicide. Second of all, at the actual time of administering the suicide pills, there is no legal protection to ensure that the person is doing it without coercion and freely and not in a state of depression. So, for example, they might request the medicine when they're not depressed, but then later in a moment of depression, when they have the medicine there, they may just administer it at that point. So it's a really unwise bill, and it can't get around all these pitfalls.
And then aren't there some concerns about physicians diagnosing whether a person is depressed or not, and maybe perhaps misdiagnosis of the disease itself? Maybe the person really doesn't have only 6 months to live.
And that's really a key point. In fact, we've seen there's a gentleman named J.J. Hansen, who's a veteran and a survivor of brain cancer, who's been speaking out against the DC suicide bill. And he said that about 2 years ago, he was diagnosed with brain cancer and given 4 months to live. And had he had the option of committing suicide at that point, he might have. But now, 2 years later, he's still alive, and he recognizes that people when they get these diagnoses of serious diseases, they need actual help and they need psychiatric help. They don't need to be handed a pill and told them that it's okay to kill themselves.
Of course, there are also religious objections to this measure. What are those?
We have the bill raises a lot of questions about who will be actually administering these, and will it cause harms for religious hospitals or doctors who may decide that it violates their conscience to help others commit suicide. So there's definitely some religious liberty issues to look at here too.
Some people, such as low-income African Americans, expressed concern that their community will be particularly vulnerable to abuse from this law. What are some of the ways that this law can be mishandled, particularly for poor people who are costly to keep alive?
I think that's a very key point, is that this bill and assisted suicide in general tends to target the weakest and poorest and most vulnerable of society. It's these people who have the least options of help at the end of their life. It's these people who would be most encouraged by the medical system at that point to take their life. For example, we have a woman we heard the story of recently in a state where they have legalized assisted suicide, and her insurance company told her that it could not afford to pay for the medication that would alleviate her symptoms in her condition, but it would pay for the medication necessary to end her life. And so we have that kind of concern to worry about the poorest members of our community who would be most targeted.
And these older people who are not well are often vulnerable and very impressionable to family members or other people, perhaps even hospital or nursing home staff, who might put pressure on them to make a decision they really don't want to make. Isn't that right?
That's very true. And we want to make sure that older people at the end of their lives, especially the weak and the elderly and the sick, are not being pressured to end their lives, that they're actually being respected. In America, we respect equality, and we think everyone has the equal right to life. And we should recognize that this extends especially to the aged among us and to those who might be targeted by bills like this.
Well, the D.C. Council passed this measure 11-2, but it's still a very controversial law. Melody Wood with the Heritage Foundation, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.